Westfield, like every other community, faced a number of natural disasters in its history. For the first 300 years, flooding was an annual event in the city, and about every 10 years there was a major flood that did real damage. Occasionally, hurricanes came up the Atlantic seacoast and struck nearby Westfield and brought other damage. But in fact, with all those natural disasters, the loss of life was minimal. It was fires that really did the human disaster in Westfield. Two fires in particular in the 20th century. One, the Van Dusen fire in 1936, and two, the professional building fire in 1952. Both led to great loss of life and had major impact upon the Westfield community and what would happen subsequently in the Westfield community. The Van Dusen family were whip makers. They had a whip factory on the banks of the Westfield River. It was located approximately where Kane Park was located. That's where the north direction bridge is today. The factory was, like most whip factories in town, relatively successful, but the strains of operating a business led to one of the brothers committing suicide in the 1890s. The surviving brother, Henry, prospered, bought a major mansion on Court Street. This was the Holland Mansion, which sat on Court Street, approximately where the Arbor's Rest Home is today. There, the family grew. He had a son, Spencer, and he got himself involved in a variety of businesses. As the whip industry changed and consolidated, Henry decided to go into the hotel business. And in 1913, he opened the Van Dusen Inn on property next to his home. That is a piece of property which is between the Arbors today and the so-called Douglas Clinic, the white pillared building which survives on Court Street today. The Van Dusen Inn was quite successful. It had 41 rooms, and in the prosperous years of the 20s, gathered a wide series of residents, particularly businessmen who came to town to deal with the whip industry and H.B. Smith and other businesses of the like. In time, Henry expanded even further. He bought a second hotel, the Central Hotel on Elm Street. This occupied the corner of what is Elm and Chapel Street. Today it's occupied by classrooms of the Baptist Church. And along with these two businesses, he consolidated his whip industry into a smaller building on Arnold Street. He created his factory there and expanded from making whips to making brooms, mops, and through the Planet Company, a number of canvas water buckets, horse feeding buckets, canvas awnings. That factory on Arnold Street was taken over years later by the Stanley Home Products building, and today exists as the Van Dusen Apartments on Arnold Street. Things were going relatively well for the Van Dusen family until the Great Depression struck in 1929. By then, the whip industry was long gone, and in 1930, Henry and his wife died, and within a short period of time, the Central Hotel burned to the ground. Shortly thereafter, they lost the property. The Van Dusen family lost the property on Arnold Street, and as the Depression deepened, they even lost their home on Court Street. The surviving child, Spencer, his wife, daughter, and son, moved into the inn next door. And in garages behind the inn, a small planet company survived, producing a few canvas buckets and awnings for what was left of the market. The Van Dusen family were surviving entirely upon rentals in that hotel. The hotel had changed also. By now, it was largely inhabited by elderly ladies who needed a permanent home. There was very little businessman traffic in Westfield anymore. Since nursing homes and residences for the elderly had not really yet been invented, they tend to go to single bed sitting rooms in the hotels around town. On the night of January 5th, 1936, fire broke out in the hotel. Within minutes, the building was engulfed in flames, and disaster struck the elderly residents. The initial newspaper reports thought that 9 were dead. In fact, only 7 died. Grace Fickett, 64, who was a faculty member at the normal school, Bessie Malone, 45, Minnie James, the widow of a doctor in town, age 63, Natalie Jones, 65, Guido Bernardino, he was the town's bootblack, George Alexander, 70. George was the father-in-law of Spencer Van Dusen. As I said, the Van Dusen family had moved into the hotel to save money. And the last victim was young Henry Van Dusen Jr., 18. From the location of the bodies, it was thought that Henry had initially escaped from the fire, but had gone back into the blaze to attempt to rescue his grandfather. 7 more were hospitalized, including Spencer Van Dusen, his wife, and daughter. It was a tragedy in Westfield. Very little was left of the building except a shell. The state fire marshal conducted an investigation of the fire and its cause and discovered that the building was in violation of not only every building code, and by the way, in the 1930s, Westfield really didn't have any, but also practical reality. There were a number of burned out fuses around the fuse box, and those burnt out fuses had been replaced with much higher amp fuses so they wouldn't burn out with shorts. Directly above the fuse box in the floor above was a bathroom, and it had leaked, and the water had soaked through the floor and eaten away the cover of the wiring that ran through the floor. There was a tin ceiling in that basement kitchen, and the bare wires had been shorting out against the tin ceiling, apparently for a considerable period of time. That was not the only problem with this building. The interior partitions in the building between rooms were paperboard, not solid wood walls. The construction of the building itself was single brick construction over balloon timbers, so that once it caught fire, there was nothing to slow the fire down. What was worse, there were fire escapes from the 3rd floor, but they only went to the roof of porches on the 2nd floor. so that for these elderly residents, even if they had gotten to the fire escapes, there was no escape from the building itself. The chief of the fire department in Westfield, Chief Thomas Maloney, claimed that he had always refused to give the building a certificate of occupancy. Now, the building had been constructed in 1913, 23 years earlier. Chief Mahoney had been in the fire department for 60 years and had been chief for 50 years. He said he had refused certificates of safety because he didn't think the building was safe, but he had done nothing about it in the intervening 23 years. There were also no records of any fire inspection, no records of any fire drills or any fire extinguishers in the building. Chief Mahoney resigned the next year, taking his pension after 60 years of service. This disaster tore the Van Dusen family apart. They had lost their teenage son and their father and father-in-law. The family itself got out of the hospital a few days later. Spencer and his wife separated. Spencer continued to live in the garages behind the building for a few years, and in the early 1940s went to California to live with his daughter. His wife moved to Northampton in the late 1940s and died there in the 1950s. The home that they had previously occupied next to the hotel lasted into the early 1950s when the city took it over for various youth services. But it gradually deteriorated, and the bricks from the Holland/Van Dusen home were used to build 3 little single-family homes on the property. Many of the people of Westfield may remember those 3 little homes. They were called the 3 Little Pigs, and they existed between the Douglas Clinic and the Episcopal Church. They were torn down about 15 years ago and have been replaced by the Arbors. The second fire took place almost exactly 16 years later. Now, the story begins with an insurance company, the Bay State Beneficiary Insurance Company. This is the building it occupied, the Lewis Block, on the corner of Main and Broad Street. It, in 1912, became the site of the Federal Post Office. Today, that Federal Post Office is called the Tavern Restaurant. Now, insurance companies in the 19th century were different kind of operations than they are today. The average person, a working class person, a lower middle class person, really didn't have access to banks. They didn't have access because they didn't have money. They didn't really have savings accounts. And one of the great tragedies in life, one of the things that everyone was desperate to avoid, was being buried as a pauper. It was considered disgraceful. So whoever you were, no matter how poor you were, you tried to put aside a little money for your burial. And if you were lucky, a little extra for what would usually be a surviving widow and children. Now, insurance companies entered into that market. What they did is they sold low-cost, small policies to working men. And they had salesmen who would go from home to home collecting 25 or 50 cents a week as your payment on the policies. That was a sum that even the poorest of people could afford to guarantee that there would be some kind of small death benefit, a burial insurance. The Bay State Beneficiary Insurance Company was a Westfield example of what were, in the 19th century, literally hundreds of these small insurance companies. The chief salesman for the company, and eventually he became the secretary, the general manager, the chief operating officer for this company, was a man by the name of Robert W. Parker. By the 1890s, he, in effect, was running this quite successful little insurance company. It had 17,000 policy holders. There was a policy face of $50 million. Other businessmen in town served on the board, and it was quite a successful operation in the community. In 1893, Westfield and the nation went through the first of the Great Depressions. It was a depression which would last until World War I. 15,000 businesses in the United States collapsed in the first year. 600 banks failed. There was at least 20% of the nation unemployed. In Westfield, this was the year of the consolidation of the whip industry because there were too many whips being produced and not enough of them being sold. In fact, all the whip industries shut down during the summer in Westfield that year, and Westfield evidenced 40% unemployed for most of the year of 1893. This financial disaster also struck the Bay State Beneficiary Insurance Company, and it declared bankruptcy in 1895. All of the policyholders lost their small investments. They were wiped out. The officers, however, were not. Robert W. Parker, who at that point in time was the general manager and secretary, his son was the assistant manager and assistant secretary, was the third richest man in town. The other town businessmen, who also were on the board, did not lose any money either. That obviously led to massive controversy in town and legal suits for the next 15 years. Most of those legal suits, by the way, declared that there had been malfeasance, that the officers had in fact skimmed the profits off the top of the company. Well, Robert W. Parker used his money to create edifices. His son and business partner died in 1894, and so he built a chapel and a mausoleum at Pine Hill Cemetery in honor of his son. He also built the largest commercial building in town. Now, there were still houses on Elm Street. This was still a partially residential street. And he removed these two houses in the center of the block, and he built a 5-story granite building, the Parks Block. It cost $100,000 to construct. It had 150-foot frontage, as I said, 5 stories high. This was a massive building that dominated downtown Westfield. It became the home of numerous businesses and storefronts in town. Here's how it looked in the early 1950s. You can clearly see it is the biggest building on the street. Now, the first floor was occupied by various commercial establishments, usually 5 and dimes, Landau's, McClellan's. Agan Insurance was also there. The Springfield newspapers had an office on the first floor. The second and third floor were business offices. There were doctors, dentists, lawyers, Selective Service. The draft office was there. A number of people in Westfield, a number of men in Westfield have talked about their experiences in World War II being drafted out of offices in that building. It was also held the Christian Science Reading Room, and the Christian Science services were held there. The fourth floor was kind of unique. It had 41 small single-room apartments, what the English called bed-sitting rooms. And again, they were rented mostly to elderly ladies or elderly couples. Again, this is an era when Westfield does not have housing for the elderly. If you're old and can no longer keep up a home, you got these little one-room in-hotel residences. But what's kind of fascinating about those apartments is the fifth floor, because that housed a bowling alley and a dance studio right over those single-room apartments. Many people in town remember this building. They talk about the elevator that was in the building. It was a water pressure elevator, and it had an elevator operator, something kind of unusual for this day and age, but in the 1930s and 40s was not at all unusual in big office buildings. January 1952, in the dead of winter, free servicemen coming from a bar on Arnold Street noticed fire in the back of the building on the third floor. Now it was 9:30 at night. They instantly rushed to the fire department, which was on Arnold Street. It was within a couple of 100 feet of the building, luckily. And then they rushed up the back fire escapes, banging on the apartment doors to get the people out. There was a foot patrolman, James Kavanaugh, on the street at the same time. He also ran into the building and crawled. By then the fire had spread widely. He crawled from room to room, banging on doors, dragging people out. The fire spread rapidly in the building. There were amazing rescues. Patrolman Kavanaugh in particular carried some people out over a ladder that extended from the next building. But 6 people died. Edith Turner, 70, Ellen Armstrong, 71, Jacob Drucker, 83, Christine Broughton, 48, and her son Philip, 8, and Mrs. George Smithies, 22. She did not live in the hotel. She had come to visit Christine Broughton, and apparently, because she was new to the building and the fires and the smoke, she lost her way and lost her life. 13 others were hospitalized. Fire departments from West Springfield, Holyoke, Southwick came to help fight the fire. The building went up in an amazing blaze that attracted all downtown residents that night. The next morning, the building was a wreck with icicles from top to bottom, and clearly nothing could be saved. There was some question about why the building had burned so fast. It certainly looked like an imposing granite building. It should have had some resistance to the fire. But if you look at the back of the building, you notice that what in fact it was again a single brick-walled construction tenement. This is the 2 wings of the back with an air shaft between them, which helped the fire spread. The beautiful looking building had a granite-faced front. But other than that, this was a huge timber construction with a single brick layer cover. The building also had a history of fires. As I said at the beginning, this was a building that had had a lot of problems. The owner, Robert W. Parker, had faced lawsuit after lawsuit during the early years. And in fact, he said that there had been numerous plots against his life. His health broke down. He was in the wheelchair the last few years of his life, but he never went anywhere without a bodyguard. And he also carried a loaded pistol all the time. His home on Court Street never had the lights turned out. And there were a series of mysterious fires that struck his home and the carriage barn behind it as long as he lived there. Park's block itself was also struck by a series of mysterious fires. Now, the building was completed in 1896. The first fire was in 1897. 1908, 1913, 1927, 1929. There were fires, some of them quite significant, in the building. The fires were all contained, but only after extreme efforts from the Westfield Fire Department, which did not have the equipment to deal with a 5-story building. There were no ladders in the fire department. Certainly there was no ladder truck that could reach the upper floors. Also, there were no hoses, and there was no pumper strong enough to pump water to the upper floors. When the early fires broke out, they broke out in a series of attics in the very top floor. And in repairs, small partitions were built up throughout the attics to support the roof. In addition, this was a timber building with timber floors, as I described. In the late 19th and early 20th century, it was common practice in buildings with wooden floors to use sweeping compound to clean them. This was an oily sawdust that was thrown on the floor, was then swept across the floor, it picked up the dust, and it polished the floor at the same time by leaving behind a coat of oil. There had been 50 years of oiling the wooden floors throughout this building. Once they caught fire, they exploded. Needless to say, this was a disaster for Westfield. In many ways, downtown Westfield never recovered. In fact, what happened was all those professional offices that had once been in that building went out to the side streets. The doctors, the lawyers, the dentists began to buy up homes on Court and Broad and Elm Street and put their offices in those homes. What that meant is that people no longer collected down on Elm Street, down on the commercial district. This big hole in the ground had to be replaced. There were various calls to build back a multi-story commercial building, but in the early 1950s, no one was doing that kind of construction in downtown properties. This was the beginning of the shopping center era. There were calls for a hotel downtown, which may sound familiar to those who know Westfield's subsequent history. There have been numerous calls in all the decades I've been here about putting a hotel downtown. Instead, single-story construction was put in its place. And over the next 10 or 20 years, a variety of smaller businesses occupied that single-story, quick construction. Ultimately, just a few years ago, all of the properties in that block of Elm Street were taken down, and today Westfield has a great big empty block where the professional building once stood. Downtown Westfield never really recovered from this fire. There were numerous other fires in Westfield that destroyed downtown businesses, but it was these two, the Van Dusen fire of 1936 and the professional building fire of 1952, both with substantial loss of life, that tore the heart out of the commercial life of the center of Westfield.